Okay. Hi everyone. I'm gonna go ahead and get things started. Hi Paco. I'm Hope. Something came up with Samaya and she's not able to be here today. So I'm gonna go ahead and introduce on her behalf, but we're really, really glad to have you here and to see your documentary today. So thanks so much. And just as a quick introduction for everyone, Dr. Perez is a transportation and energy systems expert specializing in global EV supply chains and trade, battery circularity, and industrial policy. And he is one of our very own PhD students in energy systems from UC Davis. And he is now the Deputy Director of the Global South Clean Transportation Center at UC Davis. So I'm so excited to see your documentary today, and I will turn things over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hope. Can you hear me? Just confirm.
Yep. Yeah, we can.
Okay, cool. All right. Let me share my screen. All right. Well, I'm still not used to introductions like that, but I really appreciate that. Sounds very kind. And she did a really good job at describing kind of broadly what I do. Francisco Perez, I'm the Deputy Director of the Global South Center at UC Davis. And I graduated actually this year from the PhD. So I was not so long ago where a lot of you are sitting right now. First of all, I also want to say, I want to apologize for not being there in person. I really would have liked to, because I've been promising people to show the documentary for a long time. And for one reason or another, it just hasn't happened. And so I didn't want to, I'm currently traveling, and I'll tell you why in a little bit, but I also didn't want to miss the opportunity to do this because I'd already said I was going to do it and it was scheduled, but also because, it's not easy to kind of organize these things. And so I really wanted to come through. So anyway, that said, I'm gonna talk about U.S.-Mexico used EV trade and circularity and end-of-life policy opportunities, which is work that I developed during my dissertation, for my dissertation, and that's it. Another little caveat is that this, as Hope alluded to, this is going to be a little bit different from other seminars just because of the work that I'm showing. I'm going to split it into three, maybe, this conversation. The first part is going to be a little bit of an introduction to the whole global secondhand vehicle trade situation, and kind of framing the documentary that I'm going to show. I'm then going to show the documentary, then hopefully answer some questions. And if we have time, I'll keep going with some more traditional, data and graphs that I've produced for this. So, okay. So saying that, hang on, let me get rid of, I don't know how to get rid of my own face here. Okay. So for a few decades now, countries in the global south, global north, have found and created a market for their used vehicles once they're retired from the roads in countries in the global south. And this international market has been created by a few different drivers that makes it happen. One is the very high turnover rate in global north regions due to, among other things, strict environmental standards, creative financing schemes, and very effective advertising. So what this has happened is, what this has created is that the market in the global north, for example, in the US, in Europe and Japan, which are traditionally vehicle producing countries, their market has saturated. And so as cars are retired or taken off the roads, then these cars they have to find a different place for those cars to be. And so aligned with that, or at the same time, there's been a rise in kind of prosperity, or a rise in relative prosperity in the global south. And so there's been a steady demand for reliable personal mobility. And so they found that these cars are perfect to satisfy that need. And another thing that's very important, and you'll see it, we'll talk about it later, but you'll see it in the documentary as well, is that because there's a very big differential between the price of repair of cars between the global north and the south, that creates a high potential for used vehicle arbitrage. And so what that means is you can buy them for very cheap in countries in the global north and sell them for a profit in countries in the global south. Yeah, so we'll talk about that later. Now, going into a little bit more, focusing a little bit more on the case that I want to talk about today, which is one of the most important used vehicle relationships in the world, is between the U.S. and Mexico. The U.S. actually exports over 1.5 million cars a year, and these are official statistics. And saying official is very important as well, because there's a lot of informality in this system. Anyway, so the U.S. exports a very big amount of cars every year. About half of that to countries outside of America, the continent, namely Nigeria, the UAE, and Georgia. And the reason for that is because they serve, Georgia, the country, obviously, they serve as kind of destination countries where then those cars are kind of spread out to neighboring countries. So those are called entrepôts for some reason. Seems like a French word. But anyway, that happens. And then, but the largest single flow that the U.S. has is with Mexico. And there's multiple reasons for it, mainly the border that we share. And also it exports a good amount to other countries in Central America. Now, down here, I want you to notice that so these percentages are represent how many used cars to new cars come onto roads every year in each country. So even though Mexico has the largest absolute number of cars imported used from the US, it represents only 30%, well, which is a big number, but it's only 30% of new cars being registered every year. While in other places like El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, etc., it represents a much higher percentage of their vehicle fleet. And therefore, whatever I show you today, and we talk about in the relationship between the US and Mexico, is actually amplified in these countries that depend much more on secondhand cars than even Mexico does. All right, so now I've talked about Mexico specifically now, but I want to talk about the north, which is where I'm from. And so I think, again, I'm setting the context for why we decided to do this documentary. The reason that I want to talk about the north is because, I'm from Ensenada. So the reason I want to talk about the north is because the north has a very different economic dynamic than the rest of the country. For just as a small example, Baja California changes the daylight savings times with California rather than with the rest of the country or Mexico City. And that's just because, historically we've been 3,000 miles away from Mexico City. And so the economy there is much more tied to whatever California has. And I mean, California is the fourth largest economy in the world. So you can only imagine how much of a linkage or intertwinement there is between the way we work in Baja and the way in whatever California does. We also have now something that's more important to this. We also have special tax what do you call it? Special tax structures, I guess, in the north, which allow for which have a lower, for example, a consumption tax. So whenever you buy something, you're taxed less, and that's to support the local economy and avoid people trying to go buy everything across the border. So that's one thing. And the other thing that's very important is that for a long time, the border states have allowed the import legally of secondhand cars from the U.S. to be driven in Mexico. Now, what that's created is that I mean, there's just a lot of supply of these cars, and so they're very inexpensive. And what that's created is that a lot of cars get imported legally, but then there's also a lot of very big amount of informality, and it's laid the ground or kind of lay the foundation for a kind of informal market of cars, which is what the documentary is about. Okay, so the documentary is, well, I'll let it speak for itself, but I'm very proud to show you this today. And I told you why I told you that I was going to tell you why I'm not there. And the reason I'm not there is because today, actually, I mean, I'm sitting here in the venue. We got awarded the best short environmental film in Mexico City. So that's why I wasn't able to come. And that's why I'm doing this, remotely. But I'm very proud of this movie. We had originally been working on it. I mean, we had originally started this research as an academic kind of process, where we were trying to get data for vehicle imports and exports and what kind of cars and all of that. And what we noticed is that it's very hard to, I mean, the data is notoriously, underreported, difficult to get, not very well documented. And so what we decided to do was, we got a little grant and we decided to go down there and do interviews on the ground to see, what the situation was and see if we could get a statistic on what the cars, how many cars there were, if there were EVs being imported already, and who was dealing with them, and who participated in all of this system. And so once we were down there, we decided, this story is just too interesting to just live in a paper that hopefully my colleagues read, but it has limited reach. And so that's why we decided to do this. And fortunately, for being our first documentary, it's been very well received, and now I'm very happy to share it with you. All right, now that said, I'm now going to change my sharing and share the documentary.
Tengo un carro Chevrolet Cobalt, modelo 2010. Lo tengo desde hace aproximadamente 4 años. El carro lo compramos con la amiga del esposo de mi mamá. Ese carro nos costó alrededor de $1,500. Venía en muy buenas condiciones y pues estuvimos ahorrando. Sí tiene placas americanas, de las placas que le corresponden al vehículo son las que trae. Intenté hacerlo el decreto, hay pasos, entonces fuimos por paso número 1 y pagamos una cierta cantidad, todo iba muy bien hasta que llegó el paso número 2 y no nos dejaron proceder. Entonces pues decidimos pues, ya no seguir con el proceso de la legalización de las placas del vehículo, ¿no? Por lo mismo.
Un carro chocolate es una modalidad del carro importado a México proveniente de Estados Unidos que no se ha registrado de manera legal en el país para manejarse. Hay como una gran disponibilidad de estos carros que los mismos americanos se están deshaciendo de ellos y los mexicanos hemos decidido aprovechar para empezar a traerlos al país.
In the United States, cars may be taken off the road due to factory defects, accidents, or repair costs exceeding the estimated value of the vehicle. If still under warranty, vehicles may be returned to the manufacturer. However, if declared total losses, they typically become the property of auto insurance companies, which auction them off. In the past, domestic dismantlers had almost exclusive access to these auctions, acquiring these cars for spare parts. Today, online auctions allow increasing numbers of buyers from all around the world to bid on these vehicles, repair them, and resell them, driving a global second-hand vehicle market. At these auctions, taxes and title fees are added to the winning bids. The cars are then transported to a storage yard in the US, where mechanics, usually from Mexico, repair them so that finally, someone with US citizenship can drive them across the border to Mexico. To avoid setbacks during transport to the final destination within Mexico, unofficial payments are sometimes required. Although the buyer ultimately pays more than the original auction bid, the final cost is still less than half of what a new vehicle would cost in Mexico, and they get a car in much better condition than what they could afford for the same price in Mexico.
Se estima que Estados Unidos exporta más o menos el 15% de los carros que se retiran anualmente. Esta dinámica de exportación de los carros ayuda a quitar los carros viejos del camino para que entren carros nuevos, ¿no? Hay dos maneras en que los carros ingresan al país. Una de esas maneras es vía la importación legal que se hace en aduanas y la otra es simplemente ingresándolos y no registrándolo ni como exportación en Estados Unidos ni como importación en México. A esos carros se les llama carros chocolate. Se les llama así porque en México a las cosas que son informales o ilegales les decimos chuecos, como torcido. La palabra suena a chocolate y entonces les empezamos a decir coloquialmente autochocolate.
In northern Mexico, the demand for used cars is driven by rapid population growth, unregulated urban expansion, underinvestment in public transportation, and a strong network of skilled, low-cost repair services. With an average price of $2,000, 12 times less than a new car, these vehicles are essential for daily mobility and the functioning of the economy in its current state, as they are often the only viable option for many people. However, enforcement is limited. Law enforcement agencies, vehicle registries, and authorities are overwhelmed, lacking the capacity to process the vast number of unlawful vehicles.
Sí, definitivamente, sí intenté comprar vehículos mexicanos, vehículos ya importados, fronterizos, legales. Y wow, sí es están muy caros, están muy caros.
The U.S. adopted the goal for 100% of their domestic new vehicle sales to be electric by 2035, while in Mexico, this goal is set for 2040.
Lo que creemos es que a la par de que se desarrolle la infraestructura para acomodar o dar servicio a los vehículos nuevos, pues también se van a ir pudiendo utilizar vehículos usados, importados de Estados Unidos, ¿no? Es lo que va a hacer que detone la importación de estos vehículos.
Historically, while exporting used cars reduces emissions from the U.S. fleet, this dynamic has shifted the environmental burden to Mexico through vehicles that are more polluting per mile than the country's average alternative. Moreover, the emissions of airborne pollutants that pose public health risks are concentrated in the communities that depend most on these vehicles, often lower-income communities, which are the most vulnerable. In contrast, used EVs could reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 82% and toxic pollutants by approximately 95% compared to the average vehicle in the country.
Roberto y yo tenemos un carro Ford Escape híbrido 2008. Quería una camioneta justamente de ese tipo y híbrida quería, ¿no? Y por eso decidimos, una, porque la gasolina sí se ahorra muchísimo en gasolina y aparte porque ayuda al medio ambiente, ¿no? Que ya da mucha culpa traer carros que no, yo sé que es difícil ahí qué hacer, pero sí, para que no generara tanta contaminación también. Yo pensaba que incluso no era tanto, pero de verdad seguido apaga el motor, pues, ¿no? Entonces los residuos que deja, pues sí se minimizan un montón, pues, entonces eso me gusta mucho, ¿no? La gasolina de este carro, a comparación del solar, yo creo que dura unas 3 veces más. Le pones 100 pesos y andas por un montón de lugares. Pues lo usamos bastante y de uso rudo porque, vamos a empezar por Roberto, lo usa para transportar equipo de música, para transportar, instalar bocinas. En el caso mío, para poder cargar algún equipo de cine cuando estemos grabando, y lo usamos mucho para ir a la playa con los perros, ahí me los llevo atrás, y siempre que le ha fallado algo, cualquier cosa, siempre te asustan de que ese se va a ocupar un especialista en híbridos o lo que sea, y cuesta $1,000. Han lanzado la cifra de $1,000 varias veces, y entonces lo que ha pasado al final ha sido siempre que se puede solucionar de otras maneras, que no es eso, pero me da miedo pues que se descomponga porque pues la situación económica quisiera invertir más bien en regularizarlo, en crecer en vez de arreglarlo a tan caro, pues a tan alto precio, ¿no?
Soy técnico especializado en autos híbridos eléctricos. Mi taller ha estado de alta en el 2001 con el nombre Taller Davos. Davos es el jefe en inglés. Mi negocio, por estar en frontera, nos abarca mucho Estados Unidos. Yo sé que vienen, obviamente, porque les sale más económico arreglar sus vehículos aquí que allá. Tengo clientes de carros que son del año y también tengo clientes que su vehículo es año 2000. Nosotros tenemos equipos de diagnóstico con los cuales nos vinculamos con el vehículo. Bajo mi experiencia, el 60% de las fallas vienen de las baterías. Estamos hablando de vehículos que ya tienen más de 10 años, 15 años. Los más nuevos no tienen esos problemas, ¿no? Hay que recordar que la batería se deteriora conforme va funcionando. Todo tiene solución. O sea, hay veces que las celdas, reemplazamos celdas para economizar al cliente y obviamente para que el vehículo pues, se pueda mover, ¿no? De otro modo, una batería es sumamente costosa, más costosa que el vehículo. Entonces nosotros determinamos cuál es la celda que está dañada, ¡pum! En ese momento ya le anotamos nuestros códigos y todo y desmontamos la batería y reemplazamos esa celda.
Un yonke es un establecimiento en el que se venden autopartes usadas para vehículos. El yonke tenemos, como lo puedes ver, el carro físicamente que traemos de Estados Unidos chocado. Todo el que tiene un vehículo y anda buscando partes, llega a un yonke. Carros eléctricos no hemos traído ninguno. Híbrido sí, la pila híbrida, la que va en la cajuela. Esa es la que siempre están buscando primero. Bueno, si nosotros vendemos una pila y el cliente viene y nos dice que no sirve, tendría que ver cómo se maneja o a dónde se tendría que depositar esa pila.
Si tú vas y compras a un yonke, a un deshuesadero, una batería, es obvio que esa batería tiene también 20 años. Entonces no hay baterías. Entonces esos carritos van al kilo, al deshuesadero, porque no tenemos repuestos pues, para esos vehículos.
Sí, ya cuando un carro se le vende lo principal que se le vende, muchas veces todavía hay muchas piezas que podrías decir están buenas o útiles, pero ya es muy difícil que salgan. Viene una recicladora y levanta los vehículos, se los lleva allá a desmantelar. Los residuos peligrosos como el aceite, antifreeze, todo eso sí tenemos que darle un destino y tienen que venir por ellos, ¿no? Una empresa se los lleva, pero las pilas híbridas no. Nomás vendemos las piezas y ahí sí no sé qué haría el cliente o el establecimiento que las pone, no sé qué hacen con ellas.
Si estas baterías simplemente se dejan sin tratar, pues puede resultar un problema para la población, ¿no? Y la batería tiene una cantidad de minerales y materiales para los cuales no estamos preparados para recibirlos, ¿no?
Ahorita las baterías de los carros eléctricos son baterías muy grandes. ¿Y qué va a pasar con ellas? No tenemos ahorita dónde tirarlo, pues la verdad. Eso es un gran problema, porque yo ya tengo muchas celdas y no sé qué hacer con ellas. La verdad, necesitamos hacer algo. Si nosotros tenemos un vehículo, se nos prende uno, yo no lo voy a poder apagar. ¿Quién me va a ayudar a mí? ¿Quién le va a ayudar al cliente? O sea, ni con extintor C, ni B, ni D, ni X. ¿Me entiendes? No, porque es una reacción química, nunca lo voy a detener. Hasta que se acabe ya.
However, if not properly managed, battery waste can leach heavy metals into the soil and groundwater and possess fire risks that are not only destructive, but can release toxic gases from the battery's chemical composition. As these pollutants bioaccumulate, they can cause long-term damage, affecting ecosystems and posing severe public health risks.
Hacen inspecciones locales como en cualquier negocio, ¿no? O sea, el gobierno todavía no tiene leyes, no sabe todavía que existe el problema.
Ideally, Americans would care about this system because we should be aware of where the things that we are consuming end up and who that is impacting. On a more realistic reason why Americans should care about this is because we're losing a lot of resources through this export and leakage system. The system is making it very difficult for domestic auto dismantlers to compete. There are a lot of people who depend on auto dismantlers to buy more affordable parts to get their cars fixed, and so they are losing access to those vehicles and that supply of more affordable replacements as well. In an ideal world, I think we would maybe recognize that we are exporting materials to Mexico. We would support the development of infrastructure or programs to make sure those batteries can be handled effectively, and then maybe we could have supply agreements or trade agreements about buying the recovered minerals back. But we do not currently have any regulation that's actually clearly saying what should happen to end-of-life EV batteries and who is responsible for that.
Nuestra región ha tenido 150 años para adaptarse a los carros de combustión interna, ¿no? Entonces hay sistemas, por ejemplo, los mecánicos, los yonqueros, los recicladores, las leyes, todo el sistema lo hemos construido para poder lidiar con el mantenimiento, la reparación y el fin de vida útil de los carros de combustión interna. Ahora, cuando pasamos a carros eléctricos, estamos empezando ahora a lidiar con una tecnología radicalmente distinta que tiene componentes distintos para los cuales no estamos preparados como sociedad.
Modern lithium-ion batteries are a remarkable technology with immense potential for energy storage, a key factor in enabling renewable energy deployment from intermittent sources like solar and wind. When properly managed, they can not only facilitate the transition to more sustainable mobility, but also enhance energy security and accelerate the adoption of renewable energy nationwide. Key opportunities lie in aligning incentives between exporting and importing countries, establishing common regulatory frameworks for battery trade and end-of-life management, and strengthening regional end-of-life management and battery recycling infrastructure. Developing a regional system for critical mineral recycling and reintegration into the battery supply will not only reduce pollution and fire hazards, but also enhance critical mineral security, create jobs, and drive economic growth across the region. Historically, industrialized nations have offloaded the environmental burden of used vehicles onto emerging economies. However, the transition to electric vehicles presents a chance to rewrite that narrative. Through cooperation, shared regulations, and strategic investments, we can turn this challenge into a shared opportunity.
Right. Well, there it is. Hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something. That's it. I don't know. I'd like to open up for questions or see initial reactions that people have, and then I can maybe show you some graphs. What do you think? Okay.
Oh, we have one in the back.
All right.
Can you hear me? Just
Yeah.
Yeah. Is there any regulatory drive to address these issues currently?
Yeah, actually, it's been very, very heartening. Is that a word? I'm very glad with the response that we're having in the country, because when we started kind of exploring this, nobody was really talking about it, thinking like the narrative wasn't there. And I mean, and I'm talking about when I started thinking about this project and developing it with Alyssa in 2022, maybe not the movie, but the whole looking into this issue. And so, for Mexico, it seemed like too small of an issue, the import of used EVs. And for the US, nobody really even knows that, or I mean, now people are starting to become more aware, but and I like to think I played a little bit of a part in that, but nobody was really aware of the extent to which used vehicles ended up in other places, let alone Mexico. So, but now that, for example, here I'm in Mexico City. Yesterday I was at a convening with uh, policymakers and academics and industry players and NGOs, um, related to. It was like a workshop related to, in short, policy opportunities for the energy transition between California and Mexico. That was kind of the broad theme. But I was in one about a table about energy storage, and I would say 3/4 of the people there were talking about this issue, about used batteries on the border specifically, and how do we leverage those for energy storage. And this wasn't, and so these were NGOs, and this was now the government. And so, we've been talking about this. We put out this movie. I showed it to them a few months ago, and so we've been trying from our French. That's not the word, but we're trying to push this issue, and it seems to be catching on. And actually, like a week ago. I mean, I'm not saying I'm the only one, right? But we're trying. And like a week ago, they released the draft for the circular economy law in Mexico, which is a new thing to be commented on. And batteries are a big part of that now. And they're going to release the national strategy for electromobility. They say that around February in Mexico, and one of the big pieces is figuring out end of life batteries. So and where they're happening now, which is on the border, mostly more than even in Mexico City. Even though that Mexico City sells way more cars just because of the size, and way more EVs just because of the size and the wealth in the city, the border has the issue that they're coming in used. So they're retiring much earlier. Anyway, so that's a few of what's going on in that space.
Thank you.
I also have a question. Can you hear me?
Go ahead.
So has there been any assessments done on how, imposing regulatory fees could impact or maybe disincentivize people from adopting EVs, because the cost looks like a big reason why they purchase these cars are because they're cheaper. So what would that look like if the fees were too high?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, and that is the exact reason that everybody buys used cars in general, and used EVs in particular. So just a clarification, used EVs are still a very small percentage of used cars that are being purchased, but the ones that are more widely available, and we see a lot of, are used hybrids, which are the batteries that you saw in the video, and also plug-in electrics. And the reason that people state for that is because there's not enough infrastructure. So to charge, there's no public infrastructure, especially in places where people depend historically on used vehicles because they're low middle income communities, right? So that's OEMs and developers have definitely not prioritized those places to install charging infrastructure, because that's not the main demographic that purchases EVs. right? So they've been prioritizing wealthy areas in Mexico City and other big cities. And so, yes, definitely the price of cars is definitely the reason why they're purchasing them. And if we impose some sort of fee or some sort of regulatory penalty on importing EVs, I'm sure that would, discourage some people. But that's not what we're trying to say. That's a very big, important thing, and I'll talk about it in a bit. I'll show you some data that I have. But one of the other parts of the project was doing a life cycle assessment of used cars coming into the country, including EVs, and comparing it to the alternatives of the fleet in Mexico. And what we saw is, even though these cars, EVs, are coming in, would come in older, with degraded range, they're larger because, as you know, the U.S. has the largest cars in the world. And so they're larger than the ones being sold in Mexico. So even though all of those things, a used imported EV would be much less polluting per kilometer than the average alternatives in the country. And so what we're trying to say is we don't want to put restrictions on used EVs coming into the country, because that's a real good way to decarbonize really hard to communities that have historically had the worst air quality due to the worst kinds of cars coming in, right? They depend on large, old, used cars from the U.S. So you could really quickly provide a benefit to those communities if you facilitate the, for example, chargers, and then they could use these cars. The thing that is very important to keep in mind is the end of life, right? So I think our kind of policy opportunity that we see is those things have to go in tandem. You have to make it so it's easier to purchase a used EV, discourage the import of used ICE vehicles, and figure out end of life, which is not a small thing to do. But if we can figure out the end of life, then there's no problem. These cars are, as you saw, they're way more affordable than Chinese vehicles, which are currently the most affordable option in the market. So, we see an opportunity there. Hope that answered your question.
Yes.
Okay, I see another hand.
Yeah, I have a question. So, is it possible that the government charge additional taxes on those trader who sells a polluting vehicle, so that can reduce improve the price and improve the market price, so that less people are attractive to buy those chocolate car?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question? I didn't quite get that.
Oh, my question focus on whether the governments charge those trader as additional price when they sell the chocolate cars, like a tax or penalty or something.
Oh, so like what mechanisms can we use to increase the
tax as a tool to improve the chocolate vehicle cars?
So, okay, yeah, that's a great question. So the issue is that chocolate cars are unregistered in both areas, in both Mexico and the US. And so you can't really regulate something that's not being either imported or exported, right? You can't put export regulations on something that's not officially being exported, or importing regulations on something that's not officially being imported, which is where you would impose a tax, right? Actually, so about half of, more than half, you saw it in the video, more than half of the cars that come in through this route through this trade flow are imported legally. So we have data, we have registrations, we know what kinds of cars they are, what year, we have everything. And they pay registration fees, right? They have a license plate and they pay a tax. And there's, depending on the administration, they increase it or they decrease it or make it harder or easier to legally import. But if it's not legally imported, then you can't really control it. So, as you saw in the documentary, these cars, all of them, come from the source in the U.S. is from salvage vehicle auctions, and so instead of trying to regulate them at the point of export, there could be some sort of tax placed on, or some sort of regulation placed on the salvage vehicle auctions to make it so they don't. It's maybe easier to sell in the U.S. or there's more profit to be made in the U.S. and so that they don't have to sell them elsewhere. So regulating the salvage vehicle auction, which is the source of these vehicles. But that happens in the U.S., not at the export point.
Okay, thank you.
I had a question quickly. I was wondering, I was kind of curious about like how changes in the U.S. domestic market for used cars affect the number of cars that actually get like exported into Mexico, or if these cars are kind of like outside of the U.S. used car market to begin with. And so that would change. I was thinking kind of just like there's this big used car kind of around and after COVID, and if that changed the numbers of like chocolate cars that we're seeing in this study.
That's a good question. I don't know. We haven't looked into the changes in the domestic used car market. What I will say, I just think the salvage vehicle auction dynamic is so interesting, because it creates a bunch of externalities that are, I think, would have been hard to predict. And so one of the things is these cars are so cheap in the US, the salvage cars, because they have this salvage title that doesn't allow them to be driven in the US unless you recertify them, which costs something. That just the process. But also on top of that, you have to fix them, right? You have to get them fixed. And because of insurance dynamics, just fixing them is so expensive. And so a car that costs Mexicans, as you saw in the documentary, costs $2,000 to $3,000. An American could buy the same car. A pretty good idea, but then you have to fix it. So add $5,000-$6,000. And then you have to get it recertified, and so you already spent $10,000, and therefore you might as well just buy. And then it was a hassle, and so therefore you might just prefer to buy a used car that is working, doesn't have a salvage title, right? Or finance a new car, right? Put that as a down payment, and maybe lease or whatever. So that's why these cars in the US, they're not really cars per se. So the ones that are salvaged, they are parts, right? They buy, the domestic dismantlers buy them to take them apart and put them in and fix other cars. Or, they're a pile of metal, and so they go to scrap directly. That's why they're so cheap. Because nobody would buy that otherwise. Economically, it doesn't make sense. For other countries like Mexico, the repair cost of repair is super inexpensive, and there's no enforcement. Nobody cares. I mean, as you saw, the people care. I'm sorry. Let me rephrase. They do care, but it's very hard to you know, you can drive around without license plates. Nobody's going to check if you have a salvage title or anything. So for Mexicans, the same car that's junk or just parts in the U.S., it's actually mobility, right? So that's the difference in price. And so back to your question, I don't really think that the used car market kind of interacts directly, like the domestic used car market in the US interacts directly with the salvage market. If that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Okay. All right. So I'll keep going. I'll show you some cool graphs that I have. All right. So just to kind of really hit this point, one of the biggest things that we discovered or that we realized, the biggest realization that we had in this research was the extent to which the used vehicle imports and exports data is highly unreliable. And to, you know, you saw this in the video, but this is a different way of seeing it. So here, just as an example, the U.S. export, so the line at the bottom is what the U.S. International Trade Commission says it exports to Mexico. And as a comparison, this is what the line above is what the International Trade Commission says it exports to the rest of the world, as all other countries combined. Now, this green line is what Mexico says, or the import records for the same period says that it imports from the U.S. So already you see a huge discrepancy between the green line and the blue line, which should be the same, right? One is exports, one is imports. But of course, there's not, you know, getting people to register their export apparently is very hard. Whereas in Mexico, if you want to drive legally, then you have to import it and register it and get a license plate. And so that's why that discrepancy is there. But on top of that, there's another layer, which is the auto chocolate that we've been talking about. And so all the informal market. And this is our modeling of that, which is a very big number. And so if we add those two, we get this brown line. And so we start seeing that you know, used vehicle exports are very undercounted, and therefore also the impacts that they may have, right? So now, you know, as much as I like to pick on the U.S. sometimes, it's not exclusive. It's not an exclusive dynamic between the U.S. and Mexico. There's been reports from not so long ago of about 4 million end-of-life vehicles being exported illegally to its neighboring countries, namely Eastern Europe and Central Asia. And so what they say is they kind of disappear, they're unaccounted for, but what that means is they get exported to their neighboring countries in the exact same way that happens between the U.S. and Mexico. So this is interesting to see that it also happens in other places, because there's another very big vehicle producer, but started fairly recently, and that's China, which didn't have its market isn't still as saturated, just because of the size of the market, as the other two regions that I mentioned. But they're producing twice the amount of cars that the US is producing or that Europe is producing, more than twice. So already some countries around China are importing used cars, but at a very small numbers. Well, actually, there was a report from this year that Russia imported 400,000. That has to do also with the ban from importing from Europe because of the war. But that goes to show that as China keeps developing its production, then we can expect its neighboring countries to also start absorbing the used cars from there. Now, I think someone alluded to this in the questions. I just added this here because I want to remind people that these cars are not just necessarily environmental liabilities, right? They are mobility for people. They are the only option that a lot of people have for for reliable mobility and to get places, and it means jobs and access to everyday life things, being able to get your family to places. However, looking at the data for imports in Mexico, these cars are around 8 years old. They have an odometer reading of around 150,000 kilometers. They're very big, so the average is a SUV, whereas in Mexico they mostly sell sedans. And well, you saw this. 2000. Give me 1 second. Ya casi a todo. Me falta 10 minutos.
Sí, ya se va a realizar el cine.
5 minutos.
Bueno,
All right, they're kicking me out. So what I wanted to say is these cars. So we did a life cycle assessment and compared the average car that comes into the country versus the average sold in the country or being driven in the country. And what we see is that they have a huge. They produce much more emissions per kilometer than the average, right? So that's historically. So used internal combustion engine vehicles shift the burdens to lower income countries when they're imported. We talked about geographical concentration. They're mainly in the north of the country because of proximity, migratory dynamics, and the laws that I told you about at the beginning. So there are specific communities, and if I had more granular data, you could see that they're concentrated in lower income communities. Now that is to say, so this is about used internal combustion engine vehicles, but as you saw, we talked about a little bit. There's also issues with now that EVs are coming in of waste of if infrastructure is not developed properly, there could be issues with catching on fire, just the end of life of vehicles before they should. So that's also a form of waste. However, and I already told you about this, we see that when we compare at a life cycle, from a life cycle perspective, if we compare the average used EV with the average alternative in Mexico, it's still even accounting for the age, the size, everything, it's still way better per kilometer than what you can get in Mexico. So that's why I was saying that it would, we think there's an opportunity to, decarbonize for a very affordable price and depollute as well. So EVs could displace emissions from the fleet. Another thing we did was material flow analysis, and then we were able to model how the fleet grows throughout the years. The shades of blue is internal combustion engine vehicles. This is purchased in the country. Then the next level is imported legally, and the next level is informally imported. But then what we really want to focus on is how, so with that, we also were able to model how they retire. And so there's also, we see that there's also an opportunity, and we quantified how many batteries are coming from all of those sources, including, I mean, from the new EVs purchased in the country, from the imports, and from the informal sources. And so there's also an opportunity to, they're looking at me. There's also an opportunity to recover those minerals and perhaps put them back into the supply chain and develop an industry around that. And maybe there's an opportunity also for regional cooperation, given that the U.S. is very interested in, critical mineral and energy security. So maybe there's opportunity there for cooperation with Mexico, which absorbs a lot of their, historically a lot of the used cars. So this is my last slide, I hope. This is a binational issue. And so there should be binational measures, ideally. Mexico should start, and I'm very heartened to see that there's already something being, going on with the circular economy and with a policy to address and think about end of life of batteries, deploying charging and infrastructure in historically used car dependent communities, and then import regulations for internal combustion engine vehicles to, tighten to kind of lower the flow on those while trying to favor EVs. For the US, there's the regulating salvage vehicle auctions, implementing export, and then joint actions. One very easy one is to, one that this is not very easy, cooperating for regional battery recycling infrastructure and supply chain. So, maybe there's joint investments that could be made to create infrastructure to deal with the end of life of these vehicles, with the understanding that, minerals get sent back to the US or something put into a North American supply chain. The one that I think is very a low-hanging fruit and should be at least harmonizing secondhand vehicle trade records, at least. There's no reason that one country says it exports a certain amount and the other country says it imports a completely different amount. So harmonizing that, and then extended producer responsibility is a very big one that's being discussed, but it's politically hard to enact. I'll leave it there because they're really looking at me, trying to get me out of this place. But try and walk with this, or no? I'll let them come back. So does anybody have any questions about any of that? I'll leave you my. This is my. Stop sharing. This is my contact. If you want to reach out, I'd love to keep chatting about this, answer any questions you may have. And if you scan that code, you get to all the actual research papers that have been published, and you can also rewatch the document if you like, and you can connect with me on LinkedIn. So now I'll stop sharing, and I'll open it up to any questions you may have while I can still be here. Thank you.
Paco, there's only like 3 minutes left.
Okay.
It looked like there was a question in the chat. Yeah, I don't know. Oh, we can take that.
Yeah, the question, yes, that is correct. So it says receiving approximately 1.6 million vehicles a year from the US. Yeah, it's a little bit of a high estimate on the chocolate car side, but yeah. Oh, okay. And the other question is, I remember there was a grant going around where people could trade their older cars that were gas run. Oh, so I think it's cash, but cash for bunkers. Do you think this could be a possible solution for individuals who are driving these chunking cars? That, yeah, I mean, yes. That actually, I've heard people talk about that solution. They call it chatarrización, but that is costly to the government, and so not very popular. But yes, I think that could be, within the toolkit.
All right. Any final questions from the room? All right. Thank you so much. The documentary was so interesting, and really, I know I learned a lot, and I'm sure that's true of everyone else here. So thank you so much again for sharing that.
Thank you so much for having me. Sorry I wasn't able to be in the room there today, but I really appreciate your attention, your letting me share this with you.
Have fun at your award. Yeah.